Здравствуйте, товарищи. Welcome back to Russian Through Propaganda. We're on day 69 with a very useful topic today, comparisons, right? How to make comparisons using comparative forms of adjectives and adverbs. So to get an idea of what we're talking about, let's look at a poster. The slogan reads, "Больше металла, больше оружия." So больше is the comparative of много, right? Много means a lot of, as we know. Много plus the genitive. So много means a lot, больше means more, right? Больше металла, literally more of metal, right? We're getting the genitive again with the quantity. Больше металла, больше оружия. More of metal, more of weaponry. That is, more metal means more weapons. Okay, so how do we make these comparative forms, right? Well, we're starting here from adjectives, right? So we know what those look like, obviously. And let's just start with some examples of just basic, ordinary two-syllable adjectives, of which there are quite a lot, right? Сильный, слабый, длинный, важный, страшный, свежий, теплый, быстрый, светлый. So there are many others, of course. So most two-syllable adjectives in Russian are going to form their comparatives in a stressed yeah. So that gives us, we're of course replacing the adjectival ending with this special comparative ending yeah, which again is usually stressed in adjectives of two syllables. So that gives us сильнее, for example, which means stronger, right? Not strong, but stronger, comparative. Слабее, длиннее, важнее, страшнее, свежее, теплее, быстрее, светлее, right? So, again, note the stress there. Now, what about just ordinary adjectives that have three syllables or more? Well, they form their comparatives in the same way, but normally the yeah, the new comparative ending would not be stressed. The stress would stay wherever it was to begin with. So, just a few examples of which there are many others. Красивый, медленный, приятный, серьезный, интересный, ужасный, удобный, холодный, голодный. All right, the comparatives, for example, from beautiful, more beautiful, we're adding yeah, красивее, медленнее, приятнее, серьезнее, интереснее, ужаснее, удобнее. So that's what we would normally expect. Now, as with so many things in Russian, there are a few isolated exceptions where an adjective with three or more syllables does get in stressed on this comparative ending. For example, холоднее or голоднее. Okay, so as we see, this isn't terribly difficult, so that's good news. So, and this little rule would work for the vast majority of Russian adjectives, right? Just ordinary run-of-the-mill adjectives. Okay, so let's do a few examples. Сложный, okay, that's two syllables, so we're going to expect this to have stress on the yeah ending. Сложный, complicated, more complicated would be сложнее. Шумный, again, two syllables, noisy, more noisy, noisier would be шумнее. Okay, необычный, unusual, that's more than two syllables, so we would expect the stress to stay put, and that's what happens. Необычнее would mean more unusual. Трудный, back to two syllables, so more difficult would be труднее, stress on the ending. Темный means dark. Darker would be темнее. And note there that because the stress is jumping off of the yaw, we can no longer have yaw in that now unstressed position. So we end up with темнее, meaning darker. And finally, нужный means needed, so or necessary or something. Something that's more needed or more necessary. Comparative would be нужнее. All right, so that's good news so far, but unfortunately, Russian isn't quite that simple. So there are quite a few just very basic adjectives, very common adjectives that form their comparatives irregularly, right? So the pattern we just saw with yeah, we could think of that as the regular pattern. And if we didn't know any better, we would expect all adjectives to follow that pattern. So we've got to watch for those that don't. And again, most of these are quite common. So let's look at a few, first of all, that are just basically completely irregular. We have to basically learn these. Большой, the comparative meaning bigger is больше, and we actually saw that same form just a moment ago. So больше can mean both bigger and more, right? As we saw in the poster, in the poster there, it meant more. So again, you might want to pencil in here that больше can also be the comparative of много, but it's also, and was originally, of course, we can see that it's actually from большой. That's the form that it derives from, and we get больше. Маленький gives the comparative меньше, smaller or less of something. Good, хороший, gives лучше, meaning better. Плохой gives хуже. And we see that a lot of these forms are just completely unpredictable, right? Хороший, лучший, those are actually from different stems, right? As with плохой, хуже, right? There's no way in the world we could predict that, of course. Далекий, meaning far away, further, is дальше. Дешевый, cheap, cheaper, is дешевле. Поздний, поздний, the comparative is позже, позже. Again, not very predictable, obviously. Ранний gives раньше, earlier. Молодой gives младше. Now more on that in a later. Basically, there's the form mladше is typically used to refer to younger siblings only. So we're going to see in just a moment another comparative form from молодой. So молодой gives mladше, which is again used to refer to a younger sibling. Like my brother's younger than I am. Okay, old, starый, gives starше, older. And долгий, long in a temporal sense, like a long time. Дольше, дольше means for a longer time. Okay, now we have a second column here of what we might call irregular comparatives, but these are a little bit more predictable in the sense that they basically just involve a consonant mutation, right? The final consonant is mutating according to the patterns we've already seen with verbs and whatnot. So these, let's start with adjectives whose basic forms ends in a z, g, d. Those are all going to mutate to zh. So дорогой gives дороже, молодой, моложе, твердый, тверже, близкий, ближе, узкий, уже, низкий, ниже. Okay, for those forms there in the black box, there's one additional little trick. We're basically ignoring the K, right? So these adjectives were formed originally with the suffix ski, and since that suffix it doesn't have anything to do with the actual root of the adjective, it's just basically ignored for purposes of forming comparatives, right? So look, for example, bliski, we're just ignoring the key completely and working with bliz. Bliz is our stem. It ends in a z, which mutates to zh, and that gives us blizhe. Right, uz becomes uge, niz, nije. Right, so that's a useful little pattern to pick up on. Now, similarly with adjectives ending in a te or a ka, that's going to mutate to a ch for these adjectives, right? So богатый gives богаче, громкий, громче, жаркий, жарче, легкий, легкий, легче. Note the yo becomes yeah there for no particular reason. Мягкий, мягче, and короткий becomes короче. So again, the black box there, that's showing us that we're ignoring that ki, we're ignoring the ka, we're working with karot. The t mutates, we get короче. Finally, less frequently seen, but some adjectives ending in a final s or cha, that's going to mutate to sh. Высокий gives выше. We're ignoring there the oki, and тихий gives тише. Finally, what about the cluster mutation, este? That's going to mutate as a cluster, giving us sh, right? So простой gives проще, and частый gives чаще. But again, there aren't very many examples like that. Okay, so that covers, again, the vast majority of Russian adjectives. Most are going to form regular comparatives, but again, we have some very common ones, most of which, the most important ones are given here to you in this table that form their irregular that comparatives in some way that's slightly unpredictable. Okay, one quick note that's quite important. What part of speech are these comparative forms we just used? They actually do double duty. They can be used both adjectively and adverbially. right? So let's take, for example, the adjective bystre. Bystre means fast. We created the comparative form bysтрее, which can mean both, for example, she is faster. That could be understood in English as a comparative adjective, or also it can work in Russian as a comparative adverb, right? For example, она бегает быстрее, right? Meaning she runs more quickly, right? That's an adverbial use of that form быстрее. Она быстрее, we could read that as a predicate adjective, right? She is faster in English, it would be, right? Or she is quick. Or он быстрее, he is faster. Now, we see that these are basically, if we're being strict about it, these forms are adverbial, right? Even though they do double duty in Russian for both, making comparisons of adjectives and adverbs, the forms themselves are adverbial. And one way we can see that is that they don't have any case agreement. Right, so look at the final two examples. Она быстрее, он быстрее. The form of the comparative is not changing to agree with the subject, even though we've changed the gender, right? For она and on, we get the same form, быстрее. So again, we could read that as basically as doing the work of a predicate adjective, right? But the form is, strictly speaking, adverbial, and therefore doesn't change. Now let's look at a quick poster. Armia mira всех сильнее. The army of peace is stronger than all, meaning here the Krasnaya Armia. And there's a little kind of marching song, and you hear this quite often, the Krasnaya Armia всех сильнее, or at least you used to hear it in the Soviet Union, meaning the Red Army is stronger than all other armies. Now note that here we're getting not сильнее, but сильней. And that's an alternate form of these comparatives, right? If a comparative could normally end in yeah, like one of those regular comparatives, you may also see a form in yay, like again here instead of сильнее, we're seeing сильней. So just think of that as an alternate form. And you're going to see it, you might see it quite often in, for example, poetry, when a poet needs to save one syllable, right? They might opt for сильней instead of сильнее. Okay, so we've learned the forms here. How do we use them to make actual comparisons? Well, we use the genitive case. For example, она быстрее брата, right? Brat in the genitive means she's faster than her brother. So we can express this comparison than her brother in Russian using simply the genitive case. Of course, we could use a pronoun as well. Она быстрее его, she's faster than him. But here, him is the one in the genitive, right? Его. Okay, so that's one way to do it. Another way, which is just as good, it means exactly the same thing, is to use чем plus the nominative, right? So она быстрее, чем брат, right? Exact same meaning. She's faster than her brother. Она быстрее, чем он. She's faster than him. There with the pronoun. Okay, so those are two ways to do it. Again, both of them are perfectly fine. They mean exactly the same thing. So there you have it. Now, the only thing to add maybe is that if we're not comparing a noun, we do have to use чем, right? Because basically, let's take, for example, an adverb. If we're comparing an adverb and we're saying сегодня жарче, чем вчера, right? Today is hotter than yesterday. Сегодня and вчера are both adverbs in Russian, meaning they don't have case, right? They don't have case endings. So let's think about this. How could we use those in the genitive? Well, there's no way to do that. Right, so for examples like this where we don't have simply a noun that we can use in the genitive, we really have little choice but to use the чем option, right? Сегодня жарче, чем вчера, or дома лучше, чем в гостях, right? It's better at home than in guests, literally, which means to be visiting, right? It's better at home than visiting. Okay, there we're comparing в гостях, which means, we talked about it, it's just this idiom meaning to be visiting. But if we look at what it is grammatically, it's a prepositional phrase, right? Now, we can't take a prepositional phrase and then put it into some other case, right? That doesn't make any sense grammatically. So again, we have basically no choice but to use чем. Okay, so let's make a few comparisons and using both options. First, using just the genitive, and then secondly, using чем plus the nominative. Okay, so cats are better than dogs. Кошки лучше собак, there with the genitive plural in this case, or кошки лучше, чем собаки. Number 2, mom is older than dad. Okay, first the genitive, mama starsha papi, or using чем, mama starsha чем papa. Number 3, my brother is younger than I am. Okay, let's start with the genitive, brat mладше меня, or using чем, brat mладше чем я. Number 4, the opera is more interesting than ballet. Using the genitive, opera интереснее балета, or opera интереснее чем балет. Okay, number 5, a cat is softer than a crocodile. Кошка мягче крокодила in the genitive, or кошка мягче чем крокодил. 6, my article is longer than yours. All right, моя статья длиннее твоей in the genitive, and note we're getting твоей. We need a feminine genitive form because we're talking about an article. Or using чем, моя статья длиннее твоя. Sorry, длиннее чем твоя. Моя статья длиннее чем твоя. 7, the children are more hungry than the parents. Дети голоднее, sorry, the stress shift. Дети голоднее родителей would be the genitive form. Or using чем, дети голоднее, чем родители. 8, chemistry is harder than physics, simpler than physics. Химия проще физики, using the genitive. I'm not sure that's true, but this is just an example, right? Don't get angry, you chemistry students. Okay, let's see. Now using чем, химия проще, чем физика. Химия проще, чем физика. Okay, let's try making some more comparison statements here. And for the first 5, we're going to be comparing nouns, I think, so we can use the genitive. Or we could use чем, right? But let's practice using the genitive here. My friend speaks Russian better than me. Мой друг говорит по-русски better than me, лучше, чем я. Or, again, genitive would be лучше меня. Он говорит лучше меня. Number 2, her dog is bigger than my cat. Ее собака больше, чем моя кошка, or to use the genitive, больше моей кошки. Number 3, my friend is younger than me by 5 years. My brother, sorry. Мой брат младше меня на 5 лет. If we want to specify by how many or how much something is more or less or whatever, younger, older, we get na plus the accusative of the number, на 5 лет. Wine is more expensive than beer. Вино дороже пива. Вино дороже пива. Number 5, an apartment is more comfortable than the dorm. Квартира удобнее общежития. Okay, so again, if we're comparing nouns or pronouns, because a pronoun or a noun can go into the genitive case, obviously, then we can certainly use that format. Or we could also use the чем plus the nominative. Now, the next 5 examples, we're comparing something other than nouns. And for that reason, again, since we really, if we're not comparing a noun or a pronoun or an adjective or something, we can't use genitive case. And that leaves us no choice but to use чем. Okay, so number 6, tomorrow will be warmer than today. We're comparing tomorrow and today. Today is, of course, an adverb. Right, so сегодня будет теплее, чем вчера. We've got to use the чем there in front of the adverb вчера. Number 7, in winter it's colder in Russia than in America. Okay, here we do have nouns, but what we're actually comparing are prepositional phrases, right? So зимой холоднее в России, чем в Америке. Right? Чем в Америке, right? В Америке, let's think about it for a moment. В Америке is a prepositional phrase. Of course, the v requires the prepositional case. So there's no way we can take that and make it genitive somehow without changing the meaning. And so it doesn't work. We've got to use чем. 8, going by foot is cheaper than going by bus. Okay, we're talking generally about motion, so we'd use the indeterminates. Ходить пешком дешевле, чем ездить на автобусе. Okay, what we're comparing here are actually infinitives, right? We're comparing ходить and ездить. We can't put an infinitive into the genitive case, we've got to use чем. Okay, number 9, my article is more interesting than his. Моя статья интереснее его, we might guess. And I guess we could say that, but the problem is here we're not saying that my article is more interesting than him, right? But rather than his article, right? So to make clear what we really mean, it might be better to use чем here. Моя статья интереснее, чем его, and that would be maybe a bit less ambiguous somehow, right? Okay, number 10. They're smarter than they seem. Они умнее, чем кажутся. Okay, so there we're getting than they seem, right? We're getting a verb basically. They're smarter than they seem. We can't take a verb form and make that genitive, so we've got to use чем. Они умнее, чем кажутся. All right, we saw an example of this earlier. How do you qualify comparative forms, right? For example, how do you say by how much someone is older or younger or whatever? Well, you use na plus the accusative. So, for example, она старше брата на год, на 3 года, or whatever amount you like. By a lot is гораздо. So that's a very common, very useful little expression. Гораздо plus a comparative meaning much better, much older, etc. Да, новая гостиница гораздо лучше старой. The new hotel is much better than the old one. If you want to say even bigger, even more, even older, etc., you say еще, right? So still older, still smarter, or even smarter. Ее брат очень умный, она еще умнее его. Right? Her brother's very smart, but she's still smarter. She's even smarter than he is. Я хочу сделать эту работу как можно лучше. Okay, here's a very useful expression, as blank as possible. How do we make that in Russian? Well, как можно plus a comparative. So just learn that little formula. It's a very useful one. Я хочу сделать эту работу как можно лучше. As good as possible, we'd say. As well as possible. Okay, so let's just practice a few with expressions with еще, just to practice providing the comparative forms again. Он богатый, а я еще богаче. He's rich, but I'm even richer. This book is expensive, but that one's even more expensive. Эта книга дорогая, а та еще дороже. 3. Here it's hot, but in the south it's even hotter. Здесь жарко, а на юге еще жарче. 4. Here it's interesting, but in Russian it's even more interesting. Здесь интересно, а в России еще интереснее. 5. Their bread is fresh, but ours is even fresher. Их хлеб свежий, а наш еще свежее. Number 6. Here it's quiet, but in the library it's even quieter. Здесь тихо, а в библиотеке еще тише. 7. He's old, but she's even older. Он старый, а она еще старше. 8. This film is long, but that one's even longer. Этот фильм длинный, а тот еще длиннее. 9. They live close by, we live even closer. Они живут близко, а мы еще ближе. Мы живем еще ближе. Number 10. У нас плохо, а у вас еще хуже, right? We have it bad, but you guys have it even worse. Okay, finally today, here's a note that I think is sort of what we'd expect, right? This issue of ellipsis and comparison statements. So ellipsis is a fancy way of saying that we leave certain words out instead of repeating them needlessly, right? So this basically works the same in both languages, and this is very common in almost any language, right? You don't needlessly repeat languages words when you know perfectly well what you're talking about. So look at the first example. В этом году все лучше, чем было в прошлом году. Okay, so we're basically comparing in this year with in last year in the Russian. And so we know we're talking about year because we mentioned it in the first part of the sentence, right? В этом году все лучше, чем в прошлом. And so we leave out both the verb, which here is just a linking verb, and году, right? We don't need us to repeat that. So what we're basically saying is in this year, everything's better than in the last year. Now, sometimes English will throw in a do in place of a repeated verb. Russian doesn't have a verb that works like that. So, for example, she reads a lot more quickly in Russian than I do. Она читает гораздо быстрее на русском, чем я. And again, the full version of that would be чем я читаю, right? But again, there's nothing wrong with that grammatically, but it sounds a bit unnatural because we we already know we're talking about reading. So we don't repeat the verb the second time around. Now, sometimes we saw this just a moment ago in the other exercise with yuvor, right? Sometimes you can get situations where something may come out sounding a little bit funny, like you're not really comparing what you want to compare, right? So look at this example. Моя комната больше и лучше соседа. Okay, so I think most people would interpret that correctly, right? You're comparing your room to your neighbor's room, not your room to your neighbor. But if we do leave out комнаты here, it does sound maybe just a little bit funny. And so one way to avoid that here is you would repeat the noun. Моя комната больше и лучше комнаты соседа. But, of course, you could drop the комнаты and, it would still make sense just based on just common sense and context. Okay, so English lets one stand in for a repeated noun, right? So sort of like with verbs, often do will stand in the place of a repeated verb. One can stand in for a repeated noun. But again, Russian doesn't work that way. It doesn't have something like that. So in Russian, we'd say «Эта книга гораздо интереснее той» or «чем та», right? Without repeating книги. In English, we'd say this book is much more interesting than that one, right? So we would use one to fill in for a book. Okay, and also no need to repeat a verb following a modal expression, right? A modal verb, or in Russian, a modal adverb like надо. По-моему, ты работаешь больше, чем надо. Okay, so I think you're working more than you should work, right? So both in English and in Russian, we don't need to repeat работать or work there. Okay, let's do a few of these examples. I work more than I want to. Okay, so there's a modal, right? I work more than I want to work, but we don't need to repeat work, right? Я работаю больше, чем хочу. Number 2, my friend speaks Russian better than I do. Мой друг говорит лучше по-русски, чем я. Okay, so we don't need to repeat говорю there. We don't need to say чем я говорю. 3, this film is better than that one. Этот фильм лучше того. Right, this film is better than that film. 4, my computer is more expensive than yours. Мой компьютер дороже твоего. Right, so again, just than yours. We don't need to say than your computer. And finally, number 5, I drink more coffee than I should. Я пью больше кофе, чем надо. And again, we're leaving out there пить, right? Я пью больше кофе, чем надо пить. We leave off the second пить. And don't forget, ночь работе не помеха. Night is no hindrance to work, right? Okay, so on that note, that concludes today's lesson. Tomorrow we're going to talk a little bit more about comparatives and also look at superlatives, which thankfully are extremely easy in Russian. And that will conclude our chapter here. Okay, so until tomorrow, до свидания, товарищи. Вперед к новым победам.